December 14th, 2016, precisely at 3:47 in the afternoon. Heathrow Airport witnessed an incident that appeared utterly routine, but was actually profoundly dangerous. A suitcase arriving on an international flight changed its course and ended up on a carousel where its presence was impossible. Then, 3 years later, almost to the exact date, a uniformed individual reported for duty, but considerably earlier than scheduled. His vehicle granted him unrestricted access to any terminal he desired. These were two distinct incidents, connected to two different criminal organizations, yet both shared one critical element: corrupt airport employees facilitating cocaine smuggling operations. These individuals weren't merely working behind the scenes, they were actively enabling the entire trade to flourish. What unfolded next revealed just how extensively deep this pipeline ran. This is the account of how traffickers transformed airport access into a £6 million cocaine corridor, with staff members who knew precisely what actions to take. Welcome to Truth Unraveled. Let's dive directly into the case. Joyce Jury was someone intimately familiar with Heathrow's operations. Working as a British Airways baggage handler, he possessed airside clearance, the type of access that millions of travelers assumed was secure. Jury could reach locations inaccessible to ordinary individuals. He operated tugs across runways and relocated baggage containers between terminals. Everything depended on trust, and that trust became exactly what he chose to violate. Subsequent investigations uncovered that Jury didn't simply appear for his assigned shifts. Frequently, he materialized at Heathrow on days when he wasn't even scheduled for work. Once airside, nobody questioned his presence. Security protocols permitted him to navigate freely between aircraft stands, baggage zones, and carousels. He could mount an electric tug, retrieve a container, and transport it wherever he pleased. To his colleagues, this resembled another day's standard operations, but Jury's movements were deliberately calculated. He knew exactly which flights transported contraband. On the ground, he wasn't operating in isolation. Another baggage handler, Muhammad Ali, became his lieutenant. Ali was based in Slough and also possessed clearance to operate on the tarmac. Together, they formed the insider connection the criminal network required. These weren't low-level assistants simply slipping a bag through security. They were central operatives who controlled how and when luggage bypassed scrutiny. The operation's strength resided in knowledge. Jury understood when to act, which containers to open, and how to evade suspicion. Ali worked alongside him step by step, ensuring diversions occurred seamlessly. From external observation, the work appeared legitimate, but in reality, it constituted a system permitting tons of drugs to enter the country, at Britain's busiest airport, hidden in plain sight. However, the baggage handlers represented only one component. Surrounding them operated an entire network. At the communications center stood Priam Mongra, Jury's brother-in-law. He functioned as the intermediary. He maintained handlers in contact with organizers and ensured timings remained exact. Whenever a flight from Brazil was incoming, phone records demonstrated that Jury maintained constant communication with Mongra. Calls occurred before, during, and after consignments landed. Every message connected the airport floor to external organizers. Then there was Wilfred Orzu, based in Stoke Newington. He managed the couriers, individuals who physically collected bags and transported them out of Heathrow. Orzu's responsibility was making the system appear normal. Couriers didn't arrive on the same flights carrying the drugs. Instead, they flew in on domestic routes, from Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, or Aberdeen. This was deliberate strategy. Domestic arrivals faced no customs inspections. When they entered the baggage hall, they received treatment like any other passengers returning from within the UK. The couriers themselves were diverse. Donovan Bull, aged 45, from Clapham. Moses Awapetu, aged 38, with no fixed address. Subsequently, 2 women were recruited as well, Felicia Kufor, a 66-year-old from Bedford, and Francisca Archer, aged 26, from Stamford Hill. Each received precise instructions before their journey. Their phones would receive a message, a photograph of the bag they needed to collect, the color, shape, and attached tags and labels. Hundreds of suitcases might be circling the carousel, but they knew exactly which one to lift. Once the baggage handlers completed their part, everything became effortless. Couriers would disembark from a domestic flight, proceed to the carousel, collect the pre-identified case, and exit through the doors. But the network extended considerably further. Michael Sutherland, aged 48, from South Norwood, described as a main organizer overseeing distribution once drugs left Heathrow. Supporting him was Marco Agoro, aged 52, from Chafford 100 in Essex, a long-time associate of the group, and Damien Goodhall, aged 30, from Tooting, who worked directly with Jury on collections and onward handovers. Assisting them was Aziz Abdul, aged 37, with no fixed abode, Alsu's trusted friend who played a crucial role in ensuring couriers reached their destinations and logistics ran smoothly. Alongside him was Leona Townsend Bartley, aged 32, who worked behind the scenes booking flights and hotels for couriers, guaranteeing they were positioned correctly at the right time for each collection. This wider circle rarely appeared at Heathrow itself, but their fingerprints were everywhere. Later investigations exposed phone logs, surveillance footage, and meetings across London, connecting them back to the baggage handlers on the tarmac. Together, these 13 individuals formed a complete pipeline. This was a network where each role mattered, every movement was timed, and every person was essential. The route originated thousands of miles away in Rio de Janeiro. Ordinary-appearing suitcases slipped into the holds of British Airways flights bound for Heathrow. They weren't placed there accidentally. Brazilian-based corrupt staff were also part of the conspiracy, loading cocaine into bags after security checks had been cleared. Every time, the same routine. Drugs packed into standard luggage, sealed and tagged like any other passenger's belongings. To ensure the plan operated smoothly, bag details were transmitted ahead to London. Photographs were shared through BlackBerry Messenger, showing not just the suitcase itself, but the distinctive labels and markings attached to it. By the time the flight crossed the Atlantic, UK-based handlers already knew precisely what to look for and what actions to take. For months, this system functioned flawlessly. But in 2015, a single suitcase triggered suspicion. A bag tagged from Rio de Janeiro suddenly appeared on a carousel designated for domestic arrivals. Border Force officers immediately flagged it. It didn't belong there. A Rio-tagged case in the wrong hall was sufficient to raise internal alerts. That anomaly triggered closer monitoring. Border Force began tracking Heathrow flights from Rio, watching for any repeated patterns. The National Crime Agency was brought in, and surveillance of specific flights was ordered. Over time, identical clues kept surfacing. Same flight times, same weekday routes, and bags that consistently weighed more than average passenger luggage. What initially appeared as a one-time mistake now seemed like a larger pattern, indicating an organized operation running directly through Heathrow's systems. Once suspicions were confirmed, the National Crime Agency launched an operation to expose what was genuinely happening at Heathrow. It would require 18 months. The focus wasn't solely on the baggage, but on the individuals who had access to it. Investigators began mapping every movement of handlers suspected of insider involvement. CCTV became a crucial tool. Footage from the tarmac and restricted areas showed Joyce Jury and Muhammad Ali in locations where they had no official reason to be. They were captured driving baggage tugs and entering secure zones, even on days when they weren't rostered for work. That level of freedom was the advantage they had exploited, but it also provided the first solid evidence of abuse. Phone data began revealing the next layer. Prior Mongra's call logs placed him in contact with Brazilian numbers at critical moments. He was also in constant communication with jury. Each spike in calls matched the arrival of a Rio flight, connecting the ground team to the international supply line. Meanwhile, the NCA intercepted encrypted traffic. Messages between Wilfred Ausu and his courier team were decrypted, showing how photographs of luggage and detailed collection instructions were being circulated. But the investigation didn't stop at the airport. Officers followed the network across London. Covert surveillance teams filmed meetings at cafes, on street corners, and outside residences. One surveillance unit captured Joyce Jury meeting with Damien Goodhall in a public space. The surveillance operation was patient and precise until December 15, 2016. That afternoon, investigators inside Heathrow spotted something that changed everything. Felicia Kufor, a 66-year-old courier, lingered near the domestic carousel. She wasn't behaving like a passenger waiting for her own bag. Her eyes scanned for something specific, a suitcase that should never have been there. For the NCA, this was the slip they had been anticipating. Every detail of her behavior matched the intelligence they had built over 18 months. In that moment, surveillance crossed into certainty. The network wasn't just suspected, it was visible in real time, unfolding inside Britain's busiest airport. That single act of hesitation tipped the balance. The quiet monitoring phase was over. From that point, investigators knew the time for observation had ended and the stage was set. The next move would no longer be to watch, but to strike. He was intercepted at the baggage hall by Border Force in real time. By December 2016, the National Crime Agency had constructed its case. 6 consignments of cocaine had already been intercepted. More than 100 kilograms of high-purity Class A drugs, along with 44 kilograms of cannabis. Each seizure contributed to the overall picture, but investigators knew that some shipments had almost certainly slipped through undetected. The priority was dismantling the network before any more succeeded. The final move was timed with precision. On December 14, 2016, the NCA staged a series of coordinated dawn raids across London and the southeast. Surveillance units had already tracked the gang's routines. That morning, they struck simultaneously. At Heathrow, Joyce Jury was arrested on the ground he had once navigated so freely. When officers confronted him, he didn't resist. Instead, he admitted a sense of relief, telling them he was glad they had arrived. His corrupt colleague, Muhammad Ali, was taken from his residence in Slough. In Thornton Heath, Priya Mongra was detained. Elsewhere across London, arrests were executed simultaneously. Damien Goodhall was apprehended. Marco Agoro, based in Chafford 100, Essex, was seized. Michael Sutherland, a senior organizer in South Norwood, was detained, as was Wilfred Ausu. The raids were timed to coincide with a planned pickup. This meant the arrests weren't abstract. Police caught the gang in the very act of attempting to move a consignment. After 18 months of surveillance, the network was dismantled in hours. When the case finally reached court, the conspiracy's scale was laid bare. Judges at Kingston and Southwark Crown Courts handed down sentences that reflected both the weight of the drugs and the breach of trust involved. At the centre, Joyce Jury was imprisoned for 16 years. His colleague Muhammad Ali, described as his lieutenant on the tarmac, received 15 years. Those who organised from outside the baggage halls faced even longer terms. Wilfred Ausu was sentenced to 20 years. Priya Mongra received 13 years and 6 months. Michael Sutherland was imprisoned for 20 years. Marco Agoro was handed 14.5 years, and Damien Goodhall was given 11.5 years. Moses Awapetu was imprisoned for 6 years and 9 months. Donovan Bull received 6 years. Aziz Abdul was sentenced to 9 years and 6 months. Leona Townsend Bartley received 6 years. Francisca Archer was given 6 years and 6 months, and Felicia Kaffour was convicted alongside them. In total, the gang received 139 years of prison time. The Heathrow network was dismantled, but corruption inside Britain's busiest airport didn't end there. A few years later, a new story began to unfold. Junaid Dar, a 47-year-old security manager from Slough, turned up 3 hours before his shift was scheduled to begin. He was already in his uniform, carrying the authority that came with his role. Dar's position granted him access to areas few could reach. Using his clearance, he collected a secure airport vehicle. With it, he could cross airside zones, drive directly to the stands, and move freely between terminals. That morning, he headed towards Terminal 2, blending into the flow of staff preparing for incoming flights. On paper, nothing about his movements appeared unusual. Managers often checked operations across terminals. Vehicles were a routine part of their responsibilities. Yet Dar's purpose that morning had nothing to do with security. His target was a single flight arriving from Bogota, Colombia. On board were 2 couriers, Michael Williams, aged 39, and Jessica Waldron, aged 38, both from Dudley in the West Midlands. They had been recruited to transport cocaine hidden in their checked luggage. For them, the plan was straightforward. Land in London, meet the insider, and hand over the bags. Dar's role was to make it possible. He was there to meet them the moment they stepped off the flight, using his uniform and vehicle as cover. The plan began long before the flight touched down at Heathrow. In Bogota, Colombia, Williams and Waldron checked in like any other passengers. Their bags contained what they believed to be 22 kilograms of high-purity cocaine, packed carefully into blocks and concealed among their belongings. It was a route cartels had used previously, but this time the operation didn't proceed as they expected. Colombian authorities, working in partnership with the UK's National Crime Agency, were already watching. Acting on intelligence, they pulled the couple's bags aside before they even left Bogota Airport. Inside, they found the drugs with a street value of approximately £2 million. Rather than seizing the couriers on the spot, the officers tried something different. They swapped the cocaine for identical wooden blocks, cut and shaped to match the size and weight of the original packages, and sent them on to London. It was a calculated tactic. By allowing the flight to continue, the NCA could track the smugglers' movements inside Heathrow and monitor who came to meet them. If the drugs had simply been seized in Bogota, the couriers would have been lost and the insiders would have remained hidden. The operation proceeded as normal. What none of them knew was that the case they were about to hand over no longer carried cocaine, but the evidence that would bring the operation down. While Dar waited at Heathrow, the couriers were never moving blindly. Their instructions came from 2 organisers based in the West Midlands, Rufford Davis, aged 55, from Dudley, and David Farquharson, aged 53, from Wombourne. Their role was to ensure the couriers were guided at every step, from Bogota to the arrivals hall. Both men relied on encrypted messaging applications to pass instructions. The couriers' phones were monitored as part of the surveillance operation. Once the couriers landed, their communications were captured in real time by monitoring the traffic from their encrypted apps. After the arrests, the phones themselves were seized and analysed. The evidence later revealed a telling detail. When Waldron landed in London, she receives 2 identical screenshots from Davis and Farquharson. The messages contained precise directions for the handover, who she would meet, where to go, and how to avoid attention. It wasn't just communication that tied them in. The NCA built a picture of their involvement across the operation. Phone records and cell site analysis placed them in contact with Dar at key moments. Surveillance and phone evidence tied Davis and Farquharson to the planning of the couriers' journeys. including the organization of their southbound and return flights. The duplication of instructions was a mistake that strengthened the case against them. It showed they weren't loosely connected players, but part of the core structure. For the NCA, the messages were crucial. They didn't just reveal the plan for Waldron and Williams' arrival. They exposed the link between the couriers on the ground, the insider waiting at Heathrow, and the organizers pulling strings from the Midlands. Davis and Farquharson weren't at the airport when the bags landed, but their fingerprints were all over the operation. The plan unfolded exactly as the organizers intended. After their long flight from Bogotá, Michael Williams and Jessica Waldron collected their bags and walked out into the arrivals hall. The instructions they had received led them straight to Junid Dar. In uniform and carrying the authority of a security manager, he was waiting to intercept them. Dar guided the pair away from the main concourse, steering them into a toilet area out of sight of surveillance cameras. It was here that the transfer was meant to happen quietly. Waldron and Williams handed over their bags, still believing they carried £2 million worth of cocaine. Dar loaded them into his vehicle, a secure airport car that gave him access across the terminal and beyond. But before he could leave the building, the operation ended. NCA officers moved in, surrounding Dar as he attempted to drive away with the luggage. The bags, swapped in Bogotá for wooden blocks, became the evidence that tied him directly to the smuggling attempt. At the same time, Williams and Waldron were intercepted as they made for the exits. Border Force officers stopped them before they could leave the airport, bringing the couriers into custody. Both were charged with attempting to import Class A drugs. The arrests didn't end at Heathrow. In the days that followed, coordinated raids were carried out across the West Midlands. Rufford Davis and David Farquharson were taken into custody. Their devices were seized, their communications decrypted, and their financial records examined. In a single coordinated move, the NCA had captured every link in the chain: the couriers, the insider at Heathrow, and the organizers. The intercepted messages, the seized mobile phones, and the footage from inside the airport left no room for denial. On August 4, 2023, at Kingston Crown Court, the conspiracy reached its conclusion. Prosecutors laid out the case against the men who had turned Heathrow's systems to their advantage. They presented all the evidence that had been gathered. The judge told the court that Dar's actions represented a gross betrayal of trust, a calculated abuse of privilege that undermined public confidence in airport security. Organized crime groups, he said, relied on insiders like him, and without them, their systems would collapse. At the end of the hearing, the NCA repeated its warning that insider corruption remains one of the greatest threats to UK border security. Heathrow and Border Force were praised for their cooperation. Junid Dar, aged 47, of Randolph Road in Slough, received the longest sentence, 16.5 years in prison. The organisers behind the couriers followed. Rufford Davis, aged 55, of Pitfield Road in Dudley, and David Farquharson, aged 53, of Waterslade Avenue in Wombourne, were each sentenced to 14.5 years. The couriers themselves were dealt with earlier. In 2022, also at Kingston Crown Court, Michael Williams, aged 39, and Jessica Waldron, aged 38, both from Dudley, admitted attempting to import Class A drugs. Each was sentenced to 6 years and 8 months. What do you think about these cases and the sentences each individual received? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next case on Truth Unraveled.